Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Mere Mortals book reviews. Now, a bit of a new face here for the reviews. It is Juan from the Mere Mortals, and I am going to be taking over a couple of the reviews here for the assistance to Karen. I'm kidding. We're all going to be taking on quite a few. Anyways, today I'm going to be reviewing Sailing True North, 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Character by Admiral James Stavridis. There's a couple of names in this book that I might stuff up, and that is okay. This is a book from 2019. I'll give you at the get-go who James is. He was the Supreme Allied Commander for the US Forces. And in essence, this book goes through 10 admirals, with 2 honorable mentions at the end as well. And in essence, the Voyage of Character. Now, this particular book, James has written quite a few other books in relation to maritime history. And this one's a bit of a no exception, right? So it has quite a lot of historical information. Some might find it a little bit too overt in terms of the maritime history, but I enjoyed it all the same. It is a little bit slow as it talks through all of the individual admirals. I'll sort of talk through each individual one here that I've got and some of the notes that I took. In essence, a bit of a summary is the 10 characteristics of successful leaders or effective leadership, and how some of those admirals actually took in place. So let's get started. I'll break it down again. Forgive the names, some of these guys. It is some of them old. So the first one that they took through in this particular book was Themistocles. So this was he was termed as the power of persuasion. So from confidence to arrogance. Now he was a Greek admiral involved in really the Persian Wars, the first Persian War and the second Persian War. This particular admiral talked through in the book, he was quite confident, sometimes overtly so, to the point that he became a little bit arrogant and in the end was banished, even though he was a successful admiral there through the Persian Wars. The second admiral that was talked through was Zheng He. Now this was a sailor of the Middle Kingdom. He was a eunuch, which is essentially he was castrated from young, but he was still able to continue serving the leadership or the individuals who put him in that place, and he served quite well, so he was quite humble in his mannerisms. Some of the other ones, Sir Francis Drake, so he was a pirate and a patriot, victorious and sort of respected, but quite brutal in his ways. Lord Viscount Horatio Nelson, talked about as that band of brothers. Now he had character which was quite ambitious and everyone kind of connected to him quite well, so he covered it in his glory. Rear Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, so he was an influencer, right? And through determination and intellectual prowess, he was able to influence as an admiral. So there's a couple of ones that I'm just talking through here. There was the Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, so probably one of the most well-known admirals out there, so sometimes nicknamed as the Admiral's Admiral. If he was the admiral in place when Pearl Harbor took place across the US Navy, he was sort of known as an individual who was optimistic in the face of crisis. Then we had Hyman Rickover. So he was my most interesting character from the book Sailing True North by James. He was the master of anger. There was a particular piece that they talked about. Hyman Rickover was, I guess, in charge of the nuclear program, and he individually interviewed every personnel who sort of came on board the program, and there was quite a staggering number in the thousands, and he interviewed individually every single one. More so in the sense that he was quite intense. He was quite angry. There's another story in there about how some of his anger came through when meeting the president at the time. But through his anger, he was quite tenacious. So he was a really interesting character, Hyman Rickover. Would definitely recommend reading. Then there was Admiral Elmo R. Bud Zumwalt Jr. He was the angel of change, and he sort of pushed through in the characteristic of creativity and innovation. And they finished it off with Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, and she was a sort of Rear Admiral with quite a bit of goodwill. And so each one of these particular individuals that was talked through in this book sums up to, I guess, 10 characteristics of effective leadership that James sort of described. And he also went through and discussed how some of that had influenced himself. So a lot of this book is structured on talking about those admirals, their historical nature behind them, where they were in their place, some of the information that was known about them, the characteristics that sort of molded their leadership, and how that either influenced him or has influenced areas around his work. So really, look, to conclude, some of the other, actually, the two honorable mentions, which is quite interesting. One is Admiral Michelle Hunt, around her alliance, and she's a black American female and got through to be an admiral, and all of the, I guess, the roadblocks that were in her place to get there, but she persevered through. And Admiral Bill McRaven. And if you don't know of Bill McRaven, who I didn't know specifically too much about, he has a famous Texas either induction or finishing speech where he talks about making your bed. And he was great speech, and I believe he was the admiral that looked after all of the special forces in the US. So really interesting character too. Also, as an admiral, he showed a couple of characteristics, specifically one where he had suffered quite a massive injury, either back injury or knee injuries. And he was also, I believe, had cancer at one point, and barely anyone knew, and he continued to do his job. So, that's the sort of stuff that this book goes into. And really conclude, there was 10 character traits which James sort of highlights that were across these leaders, and touches up on a couple of things. So I'll just go through them. There were creativity, resilience, humility, balance, honesty, empathy, justice, decisiveness, determination, and perspective. So he sort of finished off the actual book, right, with a lot of those characteristics and how he himself is seeing what's worked well for him, what hasn't. One of the things I took away from the book was, having a bit of a look at myself, and with the quote of Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. So it sort of calls out to examine your life, check across those sort of characteristics, what's something that you're strong at, those effective leadership qualities, and what things are you perhaps not putting enough effort against, or what are you lacking, to actually go through and change quite a few things. One of the biggest things that I took away from this book as well was a quote right at the very end, right? And it's not actually a quote by James. It's from David Brooks' The Road to Character. And it is, admire people not for their resume virtues, but by their eulogy virtues. And that struck me as really, really strongly, right? Because you might put down as a resume that you've done 3, 4, 5 things, X things, you took over this, you looked after 100 people. But in the end of the day, it's really what the eulogy virtues are, is what sort of character this individual was, and is, looking back at how humble he was, how balanced, how honest, what was his perspective, how determined was he, how decisive was the individual. So those are the 10 big things to come across for the character traits from this book, and that was the biggest takeaway. Look, an enjoyable reader, I give it a 7 out of 10. There was a couple of items throughout where it was a little bit too historical, a little bit too niche for the individual admiral that I was reading through, that that wasn't too interested. Especially, I believe it was the Band of Brothers with Lord Viscount Horatio Nelson. Wasn't as interesting. I guess I sort of fast forward through to the actual summary of the character and moved on through. But some like Chester Nimitz, and especially one of the honorable mentions, Bill McRaven, definitely read up all of that and was and Hyman Rickover. Those were super interesting pieces. So overall, I'd recommend go take a look. But in summary, 10 character traits, examine where you fit in them and how you might learn from them. It was Sailing True North, 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Character, Admiral James Stavridis, 2019. Give it a go. 1 out.